Hello and welcome to the Material Responsibility Discussion Panel. My name is Katie Newell and I am joined by my colleagues Kathy Velikoff and Tian Ng, and together we will be moderating this discussion.
This event is conceived as an alternative to the conventional lecture format. It combines pre-recorded and live content, as well as an amazing immersive environment developed by our academic innovation team. The event is organized by the Taubman College Architectural Computational Design and Construction Cluster, the ACDCC, who have been formed as part of the Get It Together grant program. Thanks to Taubman College for all of your support. For this event, we'd like to thank especially Ishanpal Singh for his work on both the virtual commons you just experienced and on his work in co-conceiving and editing the speaker recordings. Also thanks to Katie Cole for all of her coordination and logistical support. The topic for this panel is material responsibility. We have invited three of the most exciting researchers and practitioners in the material fabrication field. Mollie Claypool, joining us from London, Dana Cupkova, joining us from Pittsburgh, and Achim Menges, joining from Stuttgart. We will make more detailed introductions of each speaker before their presentation. But first, we would like to introduce the prompt and the provocation for this panel.
Material responsibility stages a discussion around issues of contemporary material fabrication in context to social, environmental, and construction-related challenges. Researchers, designers, and builders assume the mantle of responsibility to address inherited legacies in everyday practices. This event tries to unravel not only assumptions about what and how we build, but also looks to question why we build and for whom in order to situate our motivations and impact. The term responsibility is often used in terms of being accountable to or for something. It not only means to be answerable to, but it also entails a caring for, a sense of duty, of good judgment. In English, there is also a wordplay between responsibility and responsibility, as in the ability to respond, react, acknowledge, and provide feedback. In moving away from practices that simply justify the present moment, the discussion on material responsibility aims to identify where our responsibilities lie in the complex global systems and network that make up our contemporary practice.
The format of the panel will consist of 3 20-minute recordings of a conversation we had with each of the speakers, followed by a live panel discussion, which will also include questions from the audience. We asked each of the speakers to provide a provocation or reaction to the topic of material responsibility using examples from their work. We also asked them to speak about the physical conditions of their work and to let us in behind the scenes by showing us the spaces and labs within which they produce their work and collaborations. As Mollie, Dana, and Achim are speaking, they will be speaking from the space of their labs. We hope you enjoy the presentations.
It is my pleasure to introduce Dana Cupkova. She is an associate professor and track chair for the Master of Science in Sustainable Design at Carnegie Mellon School of Architecture. She is a co-founder and director of Epithet Lab, an architectural design and research collaborative. Her design work engages the built environment at the intersection of ecology, computationally driven processes, and systems analysis. Her research interrogates the relationship between design space and ecology stewardship, or environmental attunement. Her design work and research has been published internationally and received many accolades, including the Mixed Progressive Design Practice by Architect Magazine in 2018, and for her lab, Epitaph Lab. Donna studied at Slovak University of Technology and the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. She holds a Master's of Architecture from UCLA and has since practiced internationally for many years in Asia, Europe, and North America. I came to know Donna's work through Arcadia, and she was part of the board from 2014 to 18, and she's currently part of the editorial board at IJAC. Donna and I had a fantastic conversation about her work, her lab, and what material responsibility means in her work. This is the recording of that conversation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Tian, for the invitation. So I'd like to position material responsibility, the call of this panel, within the entanglements of architectural materials and large-scale ecology that creates across-scale relationships as we rely on industrialized manufacturing and extraction of resources. I'd like to offer some modest cues into how shaping architectural materials within cradle-to-cradle frameworks can support environmental stewardship. This is essentially a case for architecture as a biotechnological construct, and a case for computation and manufacturing as new forms of attunement or knowledge frameworks that can support environmental empathy and lead to more diverse aesthetics and paradigms in the redistributions of resources, labor, and thus position architecture as a vehicle for ecological and communal restoration. The cycle of nature's violence has always been a part of human history, but the era of the Anthropocene acutely accentuates the ecological imbalance between the mythological harmony of nature and its evolving brutality. As of 2020, humanity officially became the maker of the planet. According to the recent research published in Scientific American, synthetic objects made by humans outweigh the living biomass of the planet, with a radical decline of planet biomass specifically. This reality mainly comes from the deterministic solution-driven approach of materialist design thinking that emerged from the industrial era. And it is inherent product of our design and production tools and transactional approach to carbon capture based in inequities of neoliberal capital. While design industry is being complicit agent in the formation of this ossified garden in which waste streams become our new anthropogenic nature, emphasizing a need for deeper biotechnological approach to architectural materials will be central to new forms of its connectedness relative to climate change. As we design and amass new matter using our divided forms of knowledge, Jane Bennett's writing on a political ecology of things comes forward relative to the definition of what or who constitutes public, and it proposes a shift away from Marx's dialectics, thus closing the gap between agencies of matter, human, non-human actants alike. This shift from classical materialism towards the vibrancy of matter suggests another level of connectedness, or agency to connect geological and living matter with more differentiated definition of public, as well as offers new forms of care and perhaps what I refer to as an potential for ecological intimacy with matter. It positions architecture away from its construction as a monoculture that is inherently based on a single variety or a single species. So our collaborative research structure coming from this theoretical framework is centered at the intersection of high performance building design and advanced additive manufacturing while relying on biomimetic cues from biological and hollow structures, resourcing the knowledge from robotics and material science. Leaning on design approach based in thermodynamics for shaping passive systems in the effort to reduce the dependency on mechanized cooling and heating, that really produces very bespoke surface figurations in response to local climate. We have been advancing robotic manufacturing for directly shaping the forms without use of molds. Also, changing material properties in the effort to reduce carbon footprint of concrete production, in which cement is the biggest problem. About 8% of world CO2 emissions are actually caused by the production of cement. What's interesting about concrete is that its embodied energy, similar to technical ceramics, one of the lowest per unit of material. Thus, the issue of overall volume is critical to architectural framework, because reducing the volume itself makes a radical difference in terms of production of concrete structures. It defines our approach to what we call a shape factor, reducing the overall volume of concrete used in new construction through shape-sensitive design of architectural components. And it also defines our interest in reusing the concrete waste that underpins the research framework that I titled Crumble, Concrete Rubble Manufacturing for Building Life Cycle and Environment, which is a manufacturing framework that proposes novel cradle-to-cradle design processes for ecological architecture manufactured directly out of construction waste and earthen materials by integrating recycled cement as a powder aggregate mixture and create new pathways for non-toxic chemical activation while using binder jetting or binder jet printing. So we developed kind of several research streams to combine a cross-scale intelligence, from structural efficiency to landscape operations of water management, pollution patterns, to waste streams upcycling, relative to embodied energy and carbon footprint impact. In the effort to sort of better understand the shape factor that reduces the volume but increases the strength of architectural components, we have set up sort of a digital to physical workflows with let me run these with testing procedures, and we've been having pretty encouraging results in showing the increase of compressive and tensile strength when coupled with epoxy coating technology due to the shape factor strategies. This is the relationship of the distributed volume with an increased surface area that produces this kind of a new potential for concrete replacement using this technology. Projecting this research into studio design framework allows to investigate architectural implications regarding how we shape assembly and disassembly relative to understanding its impact on embodied energy and life cycle analysis, as well as developing kind of a holistic design thinking and formal aesthetics that allows us to relate the workflow of devolumization and production of this kind of architecture relative to its very hyper-local framework. There's one project I'd like to share as a kind of a prototype for this kind of working. We're currently about to install a project titled Rocking Cradle, Urban Furniture for Environmental Justice. That is an interactive art installation of 3D sand printed rocking planters integrated into a green nursery at the area of Pittsburgh called Hazelwood Plaza in the neighborhood that's been undergoing a lot of gentrification in the past. And these objects would function as urban furniture, water collection devices, planters for native species, as well as they would kind of carry embedded messages from the Hazelwood community. Collaboration with Center of Life and Arts Excursion Unlimited has been central to understanding the feedback and thinking through the issues of environmental stewardship within a specific community. Center of Life has been active in Hazelwood as a community empowerment organization, and Arts Excursion Unlimited is a collaborative community-driven art project that is focused on creative self-determination. And they're really helping us to get this project started, completed at this point, not just started. So giving the voice or giving voices to the local community, the Rocking Cradle wants to be a story about new cutting-edge building technologies in service of ecologically conscious design strategies, while connected to the history of land use and its people, a story that we would like both to share and co-author with the public. The installation will be situated at the Hazelwood Nursery, adjacent to the what is Mellon 19 public plaza that's been recently opened. And the tree nursery is currently being developed as a community space in collaboration with Pittsburgh Parks. The 3D printing process is a part of part of our bigger research, and that we hope contributes to carbon reduction through this design of ecologically conscious materials. We're hoping to sort of showcase this as a possible future set of environments as well that can very easily refer or tell a story about the site's history. We have studied the pollution history and its distribution pattern in Hazelwood. And although the air quality in Pittsburgh in general, especially and in this site as well, is being somewhat addressed, we are more focused on soil pollution and soil patterns of soil toxicity. Our focus is really on building knowledge and awareness about the relationship between some of the paths of toxicity relative to rain and surface water behavior in response to urban gardening initiatives that are emerging in Pittsburgh in general. So the proposal of the Cradle is both symbolic of substrate that is formed from the earth and waste to create a protective barrier, as well as would have a remediation potential by nurturing these new plants, while at the same time contributing to the creation of a nursery as a community space. Our hope is to raise awareness about natural and water management cycles and their connections to clean air and cleaner soil within the Anthropocene era, as well as start thinking about a role of play and interactivity regarding the formation of these objects that mediate between the humans, non-humans, and biomass and plants alike. We designed 3 types of rocking morphologies that are balanced and shaped to support interactions between human plants, human soils, humans and water, and would also become a substrate for the voice to the environment itself, and hopefully the voice of community. Our intention with the artistic guidance of Edith Abida, who is heading the Arts Excursion Unlimited, and collaboration with the Center of Life, is to create a meaningful pathways for the youth, kids, citizens have a presence in the current development, and sort of give a voice that can be physically present throughout the combined language of art and ecology, and would project into the future of the development. So the medium of the surface is a porous stone-like surface, 3D printed out of granular matter, and it will become a substrate for this exchange, sort of projecting the presence into the future while using the materials from the industrial past. The Rocking Cradle provides an opportunity for voices and marks that typically would find their way onto public surfaces to be embedded and carried in form of sort of a 3D printed graffiti and more permanently within an object itself. And letters and words and messages are not temporary, but embedded within the rock-like fossilized surface. And this way of making can give a voice to many different forms of accessibility, offering legibility to other ways of reading, such as Braille and different forms of tactility. All the various activities regarding teaching, workshopping, practicing, and outreach that we've been hoping to achieve with these projects is trying to build a sense of empathy for others, both human and non-human, that is a paramount part of community building. And the work here is not just about how pieces are made, act, or look, but also how they intersect with human interaction and imagination. The cradle here is a literal and figurative device for fostering the stewardship. We are currently fabricated 3/4 scale prototypes of the cradles. We're past testing the behavior and attachments and reactions to different environmental conditions. And we hope that these objects in detail will support the human land, seedling, hydrology, community engagement, while also connecting to the past and projecting to new futures. Hazelwood Green was once an industrial center of Hazelwood, providing employment opportunities, but unfortunately also significant air and soil pollution that impacted the community, and it's impacting the community to this day. Its investors and prospective tenants are a notable fork in the road. The space what we're hoping to carry with this installation is the kind of a initiation of a more inclusive conversation generating, opportunity providing space that could bring the surrounding community together and have a mark in terms of enabling, prioritizing their presence in the space. So the embodiment of ecological behaviors and autonomous habitats, structural efficiency and stewardships, sense of empathy with and for the objects and their context allows the impact of these objects to resonate beyond their physical boundaries, attuning visitors and community members to the entanglement of humans and landscapes and socioeconomic forces. They're their own community, and they are in community with the trees they support and the human social systems that intersect their use and occupation. In a sense, the play here is a form of environmental attunement that we hope to engage as a way to start communicating on some of the larger technical issues that would enable us to connect with the people and a place. I think that prototyping is a tricky word for me. I'd like to use the word shaping, because shaping refers not just to producing shapes, but to kind of producing impacts, having a relationship with things, having imprints towards matter and towards non-physical things, having shaped one's life and the community around you. And I think that the work itself, to me, this implication of ecology as a kind of a political system that really forefronts some of the problems with our contemporary industrial production that shaped societies in a very particular way. And especially coming from my background growing up during communism, there is a sort of a centeredness around top-down production that I think this form of technology allows the different forms of shaping, the kind of distributed models that potentially allow for much more direct imprints of our lives, thoughts, and differences within the objects that we shape or create around us. We've been talking a lot about this concept of stewardship and how stewardship kind of comes from the much more moralistic framework or framework of defining morals as opposed to ethics, rather than defining stewardship as something that is sort of enforced or implied by sort of a larger societal guilt? How can we sort of shape objects that in some way have empathy to care for us, even we don't care for them, right? So these little benches or these little rockers, in a way, we're hoping that even though they're forgotten and not cared for, that they kind of care for us in terms of the sort of building the biomass or understanding their own behavior, irregardless of humans, right? So this sort of a shaping and some form of empathy towards these objects is something that we've been thinking a lot about as a team, as a group, as a sort of way of design intent.
It is an honor and pleasure to introduce architect and professor Achim Menges. Achim has been a longtime leader and thinker in the realm of architecture that can be characterized as material computation. He's the founding director of the Institute for Computational Design and Construction, the ICD, at the University of Stuttgart. He's also a director of Menges Scheffler Architekten. Achim's practice and research focuses on the development of integral design processes at the intersection of morphogenetic design computation, biomimetic engineering, and computer-aided manufacturing, all of which enables a highly articulated and performative built environment. His work is based on an interdisciplinary approach and is in collaboration with structural engineers, computer scientists, material scientists, and biologists. He is well known for constructing, theorizing, and teaching within this area of expertise. Achim and I had a conversation about his positioning and response to this idea of material responsibility. He shared with us a few key projects and provocations. Here's a recording of our discussion.
Thanks, and also thanks for the invitation to this, I think, great and important event. So I'm feel very privileged to be part of this conversation, and I think it's a very topical, let's say, theme, mainly because I think, let's say, we're facing a situation where we really need to rethink the way how we deal with the physical aspects of architecture. And I think that, of course, the physical production of architecture, which has become apparent, is facing a serious ecological crisis, also directly relates, in my eyes, to the way how we intellectually produce architecture. And I think it is very interesting to relate that to the notion of responsibility, because on the one hand, I think there's, I think, quite an awareness in our discipline that we should at least feel responsible for how we approach this, let's say, material crisis. On the other hand, I think we are quite often also facing the situation that we are lacking the ability to respond. And I think that ability has a lot to do with how, let's say, we create a culture that allows us to find, I think, appropriate ways of how we address this, I would say, global challenge. No? Of course, it's a challenge that we cannot address by ourselves as architects. It's, I think, a multidisciplinary challenge, and but it's also clear that we can offer a contribution from our discipline. So I think what our work tries to do is to really address this challenge, but in a way that we want to, let's say, increase the capacity to respond. Because in the end, I think that is a really, really important facet of research. We don't want to stop by pointing at the problem. We want to offer contributions to address the challenges. And I think that is really important. And I think it's also quite often strikingly absent in these conversations. So the way we have tried to approach that over the last decade and a half is by trying to sort of think and build an alternative material culture for architecture. And I think, of course, one of the important aspects in building this culture, this novel material culture, which is actually a term we, at least in Central Europe, don't use that often because it stems from, or it's a term that is very common in the social science. It's also common in archaeology, but it's not something that is common in the architectural discourse as such. But I think it's a very, very apt description of a very, let's say, fundamental and profound rethinking that now needs to take place. So to become a bit more specific about what the modest contribution is that we try to offer in this larger challenge is that we want to, or we explore how we can actually really think about digital technologies, not as a kind of facilitative means of extending the existing approaches towards design and construction, or as I said before, the kind of physical and intellectual production of architecture, but how we can take them as a kind of point of origin for rethinking. And I think it's very, very interesting that I think the computational really allows us to rethink the material in architecture. Mainly because it offers us a much better understanding and insight into the complex nature of material that I think previously was beyond the scope of ability and intuition of designers. So I think we started this journey by realizing that a lot of the materials that we typically work with in architecture are industry produced to be very easy to design with, to engineer, to produce, and in the end to construct with. And those are the materials that now create the big problems. The concrete, the steel, all materials and actually materialization processes that require an enormous investment of energy, cause a lot of resource consumption, a lot of waste in the end. And they buy this ease of design, engineering, production, and construction by actually being inherently somewhat wasteful because they're all what we call isotropic materials. So they have the same behavior in all directions, and they are, let's say, suited for kind of what I would call the previous material culture in architecture, which was always built on, let's say, the economies of ease of physical and intellectual production rather than an investment into, I would say, a level of complexity that allows you to be more careful with the resources that you employ. In any case, so our research is focusing on anisotropic materials, which are really, really interesting because they allow you to let's say, design the materiality of structures and architectural, let's say, shapes and forms very specifically. And that's why we are particularly interested in wood, for example, as a natural fibers, anisotropic material, and also synthetic fibers, which allow you to go even one step further with them. And this is something we have been exploring for a long time, and I think more recently it has culminated in a number of full-scale experimental buildings, which I think is quite interesting. Maybe the first slide I would like to show is this journey of discovery. So let's say our journey of discovery of a novel material culture is actually driven by an overarching methodology that we call co-design. And in this case, co-design refers to, let's say, using digital technologies to rethink let's say, the materiality of buildings, the construction systems, the fabrication processes, and the design methods at the same time and in feedback with each other. So it's really meant to be, let's say, an integrative approach that by nature also is interdisciplinary. So it spans across not just architecture and civil engineering, but it also includes mechanical engineering, computer science, robotics, all the way to the social science and humanities. So what we have done is to explore these materials that I mentioned before. On the one hand, wood as a natural fibrous material or natural fiber composite, and then more recently the synthetic fiber composites, and then interestingly enough, coming back to actually natural fibers in fibrous composites. And I show a few examples over more than a dozen experimental projects that we have realized over the last 10 years. So maybe just to highlight a few of them, I think one that is maybe the latest and a very nice example of how we can actually really use computation to find new possibilities, even in a very ancient or often used material such as wood, is a tower project that we did recently. This is a tower that we designed based on the ambition that this is actually in a natural, protected natural landscape. And the ambition was to provide a kind of landmark because it's part of a kind of exploratory path in this region of Germany, and use natural materials and use their innate, let's say, characteristics to derive a very specific architectural form that is on the one hand expressive, because we thought that this is the appropriate response for a landmark, and on the other hand, is also very effective as a structure, but also effective as a fabrication process. So what we have done is we have actually investigated, sorry, I have to, So what we have investigated for a long time is how we can actually use the very natural material behavior of wood to swell and shrink depending on moisture content in order to produce curved parts, which are of course an investment into form in order to actually build with less materials, and doing so by a very kind of materially innate fabrication process. So what you can see here is how a piece of timber shapes by itself just through the arrangement of the grain in different directions, in different lamellas, and a change in moisture content in a kind of controlled environment, which then leads to a kind of predicted form. And we were able to do this actually on a fairly large scale. So we have studied this for a long time on a small scale for adaptive facades, but with the tower, we had the chance to actually show that this approach of material computation actually also works on large scale. So here we see 14-meter long pieces that are self-shaped components of the tower, which take their specific form only by being actually dried in the kiln, which is a kind of typical step in the wood processing. They go into the oven. That's what you can see here. There are a couple of cables because we had these equipped with sensors as straight pieces, and they undergo this self-change, part of a larger amount of wood that is being dried at the same time, and then they result in these pieces. And what is of course very interesting about this is that then leads to actually the tower being constructed in 4 quarters and erected as a very thin shell structure, which you can see here. So on the one hand, I think it's a very nice example of how, even with a material that we all know, and it's standard regional spruce wood, and with also a phenomenon that we have been dealing with for as long as people have been using wood, we can still find novel approaches through a different kind of, I think, design thinking and a kind of computation design thinking that allows us to consider the programming of the material to take on a particular shape, and all that in a low energy, no brute force, non-mechanical manner, resulting in a structure that I think is very authentic and a great expression of this different way of thinking about the material, because it is also very, very, let's say, simple and cheap to get. So I think it's because it consumes so little resources. In the end, you're not only addressing the ecological issues, but also the economic ones. I think it also opens up new ways of thinking about the timber processing chain, and let's say how we think about timber construction. The notion of mass timber, whether this is a good idea or maybe it's also more a 20th century idea than a 21st century idea. And I think it has a lot of, let's say, points that we can pick up in the discussion later. So this is one example of how we try to build, I would say, methods to become or to build a response ability. And this is an example of timber. I could just quickly show 1-2 slides about an example of how we try to do something very similar with fibrous materials. So lately we have worked a lot with actually natural fibers, mainly because they can be grown in a lot faster crop cycles. They're really regional materials. And we find that a lot of the work we've done before on synthetic fiber materials such as glass fiber, carbon fiber, can be transferred to those materials. So this has resulted, and here you can see sort of the research work that goes into it, benchmarking oil-based carbon fibers, and of course the epoxy resins going the way to natural fibers and bioresins. But I think what is really interesting is that this is not working with a material anatomy as a given, as we do with timber, which of course also offers still a lot of scope for exploration, but it is almost designing the anatomy of the material and the structure itself, which I think is something that we as architects don't engage with very often. But here it is an inherent part of the design, and of course with computational approaches we can handle that level of complexity where we literally have to define the exact location, direction, and orientation of hundreds and hundreds of meters of fibers. Of course, because we engage with the complexities of actually realizing these experimental structures in the real world, in quotation marks, we also face the issue that we have to pass certain certification issues, and that are very often, let's say, excuse for not being able to respond. So we're trying to respond to that real world challenge as well. So this is, for example, the setup for getting those elements approved and compliant with the German building code. And then the production, which is more or less a direct transfer on how we've worked with the synthetic fibers before. But funnily enough, the heterogeneous, more complex natural fibers require a higher level of sophistication in process monitoring than the synthetic fibers, because there is a level of natural variability that even the fabrication process needs to respond to. So here you can see the result, and I think it's very being actually set permanent building for the University of Freiburg as a kind of outdoor lecture room, maybe also in response to the current situation we are facing. So maybe that's just as a nutshell where we are at the moment and how we try to sort of address some of those issues. But I think overall, the important aspect about our lab culture is that it's interdisciplinary. So I think what we really try to promote is an integrative approach that erodes disciplinary boundaries, but does not actually neglect disciplinary, let's say, competence concerns. On the contrary, I think to do proper interdisciplinary work, you actually have to have disciplinary competence and disciplinary concerns. Otherwise, you don't have anything to contribute.
I am pleased to introduce Mollie Claypool. Mollie is an architecture theorist and activist. She is director of Automated Architecture Limited, AUR, a design and technology consultancy in the UK, and associate professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. At the Bartlett, she is co-director of AUR Labs and history and theory coordinator in the MArch Architectural Design in BPro. Her work broadly focuses on issues of social justice, highlighted by increasing automation in architecture and design production, and the potentials of automation in architecture and the built environment to provide more socially engaged and environmentally sustainable ways of designing and building. She is the managing editor of Prospectives, an open access peer-reviewed journal supported by the Bartlett. Mollie has studied at Pratt Institute, the AA School of Architecture, and the Bartlett. In parallel to her work in architecture, she is also a trade union representative, environmental activist, and birth worker. Mollie and I had a conversation regarding the topic of material responsibility in her work, and I asked her to also show us a couple of recent projects. This is a recording of our discussion.
Thanks so much for having me. So I run a research lab at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL called Automated Architecture Labs, and we also have a spin-out company called Automated Architecture, or AUR for short. So the work that I'm going to show to respond to that question is from AUR, and it also kind of transcends both the work that we do as researchers and the work that we do as practitioners. So one of the ways that I think about material responsibility and the way that it's wrapped up in AUR is really bound up in a couple of key questions, like big questions. For example, the question like, how do we want to live? How can we live better? And when we think about how we want to live and how can we live better, I think it's really important to think about how can we design and build better, because the built environment is really intrinsically tied to these questions because it provides so much of the material infrastructure of our world. So what we like to do in our work is not just think about this material infrastructure, but also think about how the production of that infrastructure is a social and technological infrastructure. So I'm really interested in how material responsibility transcends the kind of materialness of the world to thinking about these social and technological questions. So one of the things that we do in AUR is really think about the implications or the consequences of how we want to build and how we want to design, or how we are building, or how we have built and designed on architectural production, and really thinking about how new technologies begin to have some kinds of implications for the way that we might build or the way that we might produce the world and the way that we might vision it as well. So I'm really interested in automation, as you can probably imagine, and I'm thinking about how we can really utilize new ways of thinking about automation to transform these kind of social practices and all these and building cultures. And for me, this is one of the ways into this is by thinking about these keywords together. So really thinking about the interdependence between history, theory, design, and practice, and really thinking about how understanding that interdependence really begins to enable us to construct alternative kinds of spatial futures, and really begins to enable us to think about how we might recognize the complicity of education and the complicity of the architectural profession in holding on to disciplinary boundaries that really don't allow us, the kinds of resilience that we need if we're to think about and address really big issues that are part of our responsibility: climate destruction, housing crisis, issues of social justice. So for me, these ideas of disciplinary boundaries between history and theory, or disciplinary boundaries between design and practice, need to become broken down. I think that this is kind of the main question, is really trying to understand material responsibility in relationship to these other forms of infrastructures. So one way that we have been doing this in our work is really looking at the state of the housing crisis. So for example, in the UK, there's a lack of vision, there's very minimal investment, there's been a huge amount of deregulation by the state, and this has left the built environment and the housing sector really susceptible to economic actors. It's really prominent in the UK. 1 in 7 people are affected by the housing crisis. The numbers on the left slide represent different kinds of housing precarity. And when we look at the trends over the last 20 years, you can see that state investment in housing has decreased by over 20%. And this isn't really a local condition at all. This is just one example, but it's a global condition. So there's really a lack of meaningful investment in really thinking about how can we radically transform design production policies and practices so that the people that are in need can really receive the kinds of spaces and places that can support their needs, their very basic needs, like they're a place to live. And then if we look also a little bit more widely around the other disciplines that are complicit and don't take responsibility, or have not taken enough responsibility in relationship to these issues, we can see architecture, planning, and construction not really being set up well now to deliver on all of these needs, this 1 in 7 number. So for example, in many places in like the UK, for example, planning practices are really top down. They create engaged community consultation really as an afterthought rather than being really core to what they're doing. And this has produced a real lack of trust in planning. It's produced a real lack of trust in development. And this has produced a culture of NIMBYism, of not in my backyard. So then we look again to another discipline. We can look at architecture. It's become much more fragmented, fragile. There's insufficient practices that are based on competition and undervaluing and bidding culture. My favorite example for this is this Helsinki competition from 2014, where we had over 1,700 entries. And this has created over $6.8 million in free labor. And so this is a really big question about where does our responsibility lie? Who is it for? What kind of world do we want? What kind of world do we need? And, all these practices are really historically constructed, and they're designed. And as far as they can be designed and constructed, they can be redesigned and they can be reconstructed. So I like to think about how can we go through this process? Now, in the area that I'm working, particularly around automation, we see also other players being complicit again in some of these issues. So for example, thinking about digital design is solving small scale problems rather than large scale problems, or really allowing it to think as a way of thinking about a worldview rather than thinking about a technological solution. So we have this idea of the mainstream narrative for a long time in digital design being focused on representation or variation and effect form, and without really thinking about how this impacts, thinking about it rigorously on how it impacts in building practices, and what kinds of problems does this highlight when you think about utilizing automation in new ways. So this, I think, has created a condition where you have architecture, planning, and construction really in competition with one another, and there's a huge amount of collective disempowerment. So I'm really interested in how we can begin to take back some of that and be less complicit in these practices, and begin to understand how can we utilize automation to really rethink this kind of worldview. Construction, for example, is something that is a really extractive industry, has a significant labor shortage, and it gives us an opportunity to really think how can we go from construction being the second to least automated industry to the most to a more automated industry. So we're trying to understand how can we begin to deal with this knowledge gap, to deal with this automation gap in ways that don't contribute furthermore to the existing environment, which does not provide the kinds of places and spaces that people need with existing practices in an efficient way, but also in a meaningful way. So the way that we begin to do that is think about the following phrase, automation as a design project. So in the work that we're doing, we're really thinking about how can this be an opportunity for architecture to recognize that in an age of automation, architecture must change, not just in terms of the tools that we use, but in terms of the way that we think about questions like ownership and authorship, distribution of expertise, labor, building cultures, again, going back to this idea of resilience and infrastructure or accountability and really trust. So one of the ways that we're doing this is thinking about how can we put local communities at the forefront of the discussion around automation. So we're doing this using an approach called an engaged scholarship approach or values-centered approach. And that puts at its very core kind of the ethical or scalable distribution of automation within architectural production in communities. So for example, this is an image from a taster session that we ran in February 2020, which launched a series of projects that we've done in one community, where we asked people to really understand, dream for themselves. What is your dream build within your community? What is the dream form of automation that you would have within your home? What are the things that you have around you that can help inform your future? What are the things that you feel empowered by? What are the things you feel disempowered by? Engaged scholarship also allows us to think about the following things like equalizing of power relations, democratic practices, situation-based action, mutual learning, tools and techniques, and this idea of alternative visions about technology within architectural discourse. And importantly, engaged scholarship connects the resources of the university to really prescient issues. So it allows us to bring these resources out of the university to benefit people that exist primarily outside of it. So we have a kind of four-pronged approach, which is kind of multidisciplinary, but also multi-scalar. The first way is utilizing organizational ethnographic research. And this allows us to take a mode of inquiry which focuses both on really established and formalized cultures, for example, the architectural profession, but also really informal subcultures. And that acts as a kind of setting within which social relations begin to take place. Another way that we do this is by embedding the conversation around automation in architecture within participatory design. So for example, the work of Walter Siegel or Colin Ward, and this really begins to allow us to expand the history of automation in architecture to include other histories within participatory design or even within automation that have begun to be really erased by, let's say, more colonialist mentalities. So for example, the role of women in computing, or the role of mutual aid in marginalized communities. And we're trying to really connect these two things together. How can automation enable this kind of participatory history to really be present within the discipline itself? Another way that we do this is take an asset-based approach. So we take an 80-20 asset-based approach, which is to say that 80% of what's there, and 20% is, we don't know what it is yet. It's missing. So what's missing? Instead of saying what needs to be fixed, we say what's already here, what's missing, and what needs to be brought to the surface. This is an image from one of my collaborators when they started asking this question within their community in Knoll West and South Bristol in the UK. All of a sudden they realized that what was missing is a place for this man to keep his horse. He was keeping his horse in his kitchen. And this wasn't something that his neighbors knew or anyone knew was needed. So how can you begin to, just uncover these stories and these narratives, begin to rethink what a community might look like? Another way that we think through this is the question of trust. So at the core of this is really thinking through what an emergent strategy might look like. So if we need to begin to decolonize automation, taking out of the centralized factory, taking it out of big tech, how do we put central to our work this kind of activism that might position the idea of an ethics of care, authenticity, or radical inclusivity as a backbone to how we understand space and place? and therefore like liberation. So we try and link these 4 aspects together, and we think about how the consequences of these relations can transform the way that we might imagine our futures, the way that we might imagine how we live together. Another way that we like to think about this vision of automation as a design project is really try to understand automation through how do we distribute it, but how do we distribute it abundantly? How do we amplify that interdependence? How do we do that without enabling further austerity, further divisiveness, or further marginalization? So there's kind of 3 principles here. One, that we have to have a radical rethinking of parts, like what makes up architecture, and you'll see this in our work in a second. The second is really thinking about how do you provide access to automation? How do you provide access to architectural production? And how do you consider automation as transcalar, and how do you consider it as distributed? So one of the ways that we've done this is, again, through thinking architectural parts, rethinking architectural parts. It's like, what is architecture for automation? What does this look like? And for us, this really goes back to very core questions in architecture. It says, you know, architecture for thousands of years has been designed in localized contexts. Industrialization and globalization has distributed this. And how do we begin to, you know, not just design buildings that have thousands of bespoke one-off parts, but how do we design it to not be so resource intensive? So for example, thousands of bespoke parts in a single building that has, you know, funky shape or whatever is not able to be accessible by many people. So how do you consider these things in relationship to one another? So we're thinking, what does an architecture for automation look like? So for us, that is, how do you create similarity, but also difference? You know, how do you use principles of mass production and repetition and seriality? So one of the ways that we've done that is through thinking about architectural parts as code. One of the terms that is used is the notion of the discrete, or the idea of this kind of new building block that can be assembled from a discrete set of parts and can be reversibly joined and disassembled and organized into different positions, and can continuously be altered using automation or using participatory practices, as you'll probably see a bit later. In our particularly, the main architectural part we're working with is this part. This is block type A. It's an architectural element that has that uses one sheet of CNC'd sheet material, and you very simple and off-the-shelf fixings. It draws from the post-tensioning principles in concrete to be able to get the same part to do many different kinds of things, and begin to, you know, expand a kind of, you benefit from the principles of mass standardization and mass standardization and mass production, but allow us to kind of not create, you know, hugely expensive things, because you're basically creating the same part and it does all the things that you want it to do. So I'm going to, later on, I'll show some projects in relationship to that, but these are some of the works that I'll show. The first one on the left is Home Office, which was a small installation and residency space that we made in early 2020, closed just as we shut down for the pandemic. And we've got Block West, second from the left, which we did a year ago. Then we have House Block, which we did earlier this year. And then on the right is one of our garden studios or block studios, which we're building now. So that for me is, I guess, like a really broad overview of how I take responsibility. It's really about a vision for the future that critiques, but also engages with existing practices while trying to benefit not just, you know, the discipline itself as a kind of narrow bit of the built environment, but be able to benefit, you know, the people that we're actually building for and working with. One of the first things that's important to say is that we work in a highly collaborative way. So we take a multidisciplinary and collaborative approach, and we're really working across the community sector, technology, architecture, culture, you know, engineering, construction, but also policymaking. So we're trying to work across these sectors and disciplines at the same time, which for us is really important because, again, it's highlighting this issue of interdependence and really understanding where can we find forms of resilience, where can we begin to really think in new and radical ways about how do we include people and find a level playing field for conversations to take place, when oftentimes the language in these different disciplines don't speak to each other very easily. So we're doing that primarily through thinking about the notion of the living lab. The living lab has a really rich history. You know, Bill Mitchell and people at MIT, other people at MIT are very well known for this notion. So for example, we're interested in how people-centric research begins to really intersect with the multiplicity of kind of real life context. So one of the places that we do that is outside of the university, outside of the lab. We don't actually have a lab at the Bartlett. We have an office. It is shared with a lot of other people amongst our team and others. It is very full of stuff, so full that I don't want to go in it anymore. And we've never really worked in it. We've worked in other places. So this is an example of another place, a place where I'd say a living lab existed, and it still exists for a period of time, which is a neighborhood in South Bristol in the UK. Bristol is a small city of about 400,000 people. South Bristol in particular, this is an area called Mill West. And it allowed us to bring kind of our resources into that community, but also think about how do we use some of these resources to build, again, this kind of social and technological infrastructure that lets and enables the work that we're doing to have a life after we might begin to step away. And how can we begin to sort of build that in an infrastructural way? So it's not like we come in and try to fix a problem. It's more that we're thinking about how do we build that infrastructure? Every single person that worked with us on this project, and that is in this image or in this image, are experts in their own place, right? They are life experts. They're not just people who don't know anything. They have their own stories and narratives and expertise to tell us and share. And how do we begin to, just say, how do you want to be involved and what works for you? Another thing that we do is we take ourselves literally again out of the lab, and we create new factories and production places in places that you might not imagine would turn into that. So for Block West, we used Mill West Media Center has it's a citizen-led digital arts organization. They have a main studio space usually used for workshops, and we turned it into a factory. For House Block, we went into a bricklaying workshop in a local college, and that became our lab. It got filled with blocks, for example, for longer than we were expecting. Our lab, documents who everybody is on a build. We call ourselves crew. We had, in this build in particular, we had people aged 16 to 76, and it was 50% female. This is a very unusual, on a construction site, this is not what you would see. It doesn't exist. So the lab allows us to, a living lab, and working outside the university allows us to really rethink what those power structures look like. This is just an example of Block West outside Mill West Media Center. We were taking pictures this day, and there's an amazing gardener and his wife who came to see, just wandered by actually and came to see it. He hadn't been there because we dug up some plants he wasn't so happy about. But then they just kind of took care of it. And it's kind of, the lab becomes a place for caretaking outside of the typical caretaking to take place. And it's a really nice way of rethinking, what the life of a project might be also further down the line. So I think that that's probably a pretty good summary of where our lab is. Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you, Dana, Achim, and Mollie for these incredible and extremely provocative and rich presentations. And thank you to the whole online audience for joining us for what will now be the live discussion portion of this panel. So we are here in our amazing online commons, and we have all the speakers live with us. My name is Kathy Velikov, and I am Professor of Architecture at Taubman College. I'm joined by my colleagues, Associate Professor Katie Newell and Assistant Professor Tian Ng. We will kick things off with a couple of questions, and hopefully this will give everyone in the audience a chance to think of some of your own questions for the guests, because we have about 45 to 50 minutes for live discussion. So we'd love to hear from the online audience. So students especially, please post your questions in the chat, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can.
Okay, so to launch us off, I thought maybe we have a few questions that we had prepared. And the first one, and again, thank you for the presentations. As a way of thinking about the audience right now, mostly faculty and students, and we're all educators. What do you think is most important to address for students now in terms of their education? What could they be preparing for? So a lot of times when we think about responding to something, we think about the kind of immediate knee-jerk reaction or being reactive. So can there be a way to address some structural changes to our pedagogy that you think is most important at this moment? And the way that Mollie, you talked about the 80-20 asset-based approach. So there's the 80% that exists, and then there's the 20% that, you know, what is it? You know, could you talk about that?
In the presentation, I made a small mistake, which really changes the interpretation of what an asset-based approach is. But an asset-based approach is not just really what exists; it's that an acknowledgement of what exists is needed, and that's a key difference. That we acknowledge that what is 80% of what's there is actually needed. And I think in architectural education, if we say 80% of what already exists is needed, then we're agreeing that like 80% of our disciplinary inheritance is needed, right? And our disciplinary practices is needed. And I'm not so sure anymore if that's the case, right? Because we have a lot of disciplinary practices and a lot of cultural practices within education, which I think can be questioned. And we know that there's a really urgent need of doing things differently. And we have really big issues that we need to think about. So I think, you know, that's probably something to maybe just reframe slightly and, you know, question like, is that 80% truly what's needed? Or do we need to think differently about what we already have and what our inheritance is? And you know, simultaneously, we can think about education, but I think if we think about education, when we're putting the responsibility only on education, it also needs to come from practice, and it also needs to come from the other disciplines that intersect with professional practice as well.
Achim and Dana, are there something very urgent to education today that you feel is critical and we're not really quite addressing at the moment?
I think that we are in a time where architectural education is becoming more interdisciplinary by the urgency of the issues that I think have been discussed through all three presentations. I think that relative to your question, Tian, and pedagogy itself, this idea of participation to me is really important, and relative to how we think of participation within a logic of materials in post-industrial production and material impact in kind of a large scale systems, because we are so focused on development of the object. And on one hand, I think that understanding of local impact is really critical, but the sort of architecture as a code of environmental ethic that produces that goes beyond the creation of the object, looking at a relationship between the CO2 emission and embodied energy, for example, for its post-life cycle, starts producing these pathways or acknowledging the part of the knowledge that goes beyond the traditional disciplinary boundaries. And I think that looking at both understanding having a deeper knowledge into sort of pre-life and post-life of materials, not just relative to kind of an impact of human and our societies, but also environment at large. I think there are lots of assumptions we architects have relative to reusability or kind of renewability of the certain materials that I think are rooted within our industrial practices. And the importance of architectural discipline, I think it's to really start rethinking of some of the industrial practices that are currently in place, not just from economical impact, but from the larger scale of environmental impact.
Maybe just one little additional thought. I absolutely agree that we need to have an interdisciplinary response to the challenges we're facing. But I think we also have to, let's say, be honest with ourselves and say our education remains to be very disciplinary. I mean, I think that's what you talk about with the 80%. So actually we have to start within the institutions that actually protect those 80% in a very stringent manner. No? And I think we really have to equip the next generation of anyone who is participating in this creation of the built environment very early on in a kind of interdisciplinary context, because I think that's the only way that you can actually really understand where your disciplinary concerns and competences need to lie. I think because we delay that for too long in our educational program, we are kind of conditioned to always have a very particular view on the, let's say, problems we're trying to address, the situations we try to deal with. So I think we have to realize that we are also caught up into this institutionalization of our discipline, with all the accrediting systems, all the other aspects that go with it. And anyone who has ever tried to actually create a truly interdisciplinary educational program may know how tough this is, no? And this is all sort of falls into the, let's say, domain that we could directly influence, but we don't for some reason. So I think it is, I think, really important to build those interdisciplinary environments and create a culture where we as architects and other disciplines actually learn how to work together and how to talk to each other and how to still, let's say, think about your own role in those interdisciplinary settings very early on. And I think this is something that doesn't happen at the moment very or often enough, let's say.
I was going to say, Achim, I think the term that comes up for me all the time around this is like, what are our assumption biases? Like, what are our disciplinary assumption biases? And I think one of the things that one of the mistakes that we make is not equipping our students for how to go through the process of unlearning those assumption biases or questioning those assumption biases. And also equip students for understanding that that process is very long and it's very slow. And oftentimes there's very little reward in the short term, but in the long term, we can really see the opportunity and power of how that transforms and enables a more collective ethos for change. And I think, those two things simultaneously for me are really important when talking, to example, a first-year student about what do they want to get out of their education. They might not know, but they might know what their assumption biases are that they're bringing in. And just being able to allow them to ask those kinds of questions, I think, is really important.
I think these responses are building a little bit on the question that I wanted to ask in terms of now, we've discussed a little bit about interdisciplinary conversations and even things that we need to be talking about within the educational setting. I'm curious to the the thoughts, digging a little deeper, what is our responsibility as a discipline in terms of things that we're doing or not doing, and how we even communicate with one another to build, Mollie, as you're saying too, this collective ethos that I think as we see this increasing urgency for change. So I'm wondering, are there things we need to change in the way of our criteria with one another, our language of how we talk with one another, but just thinking through, digging deeper what we see as our responsibilities, we think wider as the field of architecture.
I mean, there's three things that kind of pop to mind. One is, and I think we've already touched on this in a way, is the role of expertise. Who is the expert in an interdisciplinary project or in an intersectional project? And I like the word intersectional more than interdisciplinary. I think it's more descriptive and accurate. And then also thinking about, if expertise exists, where is it needed? Again, going back to that 80-20 approach, and how accessible is it? And what does the accessibility of it, what is the power structures and power hierarchies that it insinuates? And being kind of explicit in our responsibilities, and being explicit in how we take responsibility for those decisions, and being explicit in how we are occasionally complicit in those hierarchies of power and our notions of expertise.
I think there is a kind of a changing role of what expertise is in design within this complex framework. Because on one hand, disciplinarity of architecture comes from the sort of a service-based framework that is really set up within kind of a neoliberal political system, and a flow of economy that set up industrial manufacturing framework, and it's relative to kind of a efficiency of the material production that feeds to kind of to accommodate large masses of people and their needs. I mean, I grew up in a communist system where the issue of industrialization has been largely politicized as a method of democratization or a method for equalization. And the sort of a computational framework that came in sort of late 90s, looking at variation within a repetition, which it's still present within a kind of a framework of design, allowed for these large forms of customization, interactivity, and so on. And I think that's a really incredible and important change within a direction of architectural thinking and discipline that has been part of our education and thinking in the last 20 years. I think where the impact or crisis of the climate change are, in my mind, need to be expanded beyond is to take the material industry as the sort of a 80% that we rely on, as it's not really being changed from within the architectural thinking. And to me, the kind of some of the biases we have relative to like natural materials might be better than concrete or vice versa are might be completely untrue in some of the localized framework, where the accessibility of those materials are looking at the material through the point of how technology or contemporary production of automation and let's say robotic completely changes the way the embodied energy is produced through the different forms of material assembly. And that is actually a creative design process where one needs a deeper expertise or knowledge relative to understanding sort of from chemical composition of material to the effective sort of a stock of materials that we already have here, rather than thinking of architecture as something always producing something new. So the issue of adaptive reuse to me is really critical as well, because it's not about just kind of adaptive reuse within a context of industrial framework as we know it through the sort of frameworks of modernism and colonization, but really about thinking about natural systems as a part of kind of a reconstruction of the world, that we need to kind of build in materials that enable the kind of the emergence of a new biological materiality within architecture. So if architecture can not just reduce its impact on climate change, but really participate and become sort of a vehicle of ecological restoration, suddenly the framework of what kind of architecture we want to design and how it relates to the production of landscape, how it relates to its before life and afterlife are becoming part of the disciplinary knowledge and the expertise that is not necessarily common within architectural education.
Maybe just a quick thought from my side. I think what is really important as well is a level of awareness of where the, let's say, different disciplines that are all engaging in the production of the, let's say, built environment are coming from. I think it was very interesting to see in your presentation, Mollie, that you had history and theory, and you have to imagine that all these notions are completely absent from, for example, engineering training. There's no awareness of, let's say, a past. There's only, let's say, an expectation of a future. But I think those expectations, of course, need major adjustments. And I think having those, let's say, repositioning also of the role and how you want to engage with a possible future is something that we delay for far too long in our educational systems. Maybe that's a bit coming back to the first question, but I think in my eyes, this is something that really needs to happen as part of an education experience, not as part of your professional life. Again, I think that really requires a relatively radical rethinking of the institutional structures we've built for our educational systems, and also, of course, the training in our own discipline.
This is a really great conversation. And I'm seeing the questions that are coming in from the audience in the chat, and we'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. But for now, I want to also just build on the conversation that we're already having about both rethinking pedagogy and what we consider to be the discipline, and kind of also looking forward to how we evaluate the work that we're all working on. So the three of you are not only working on some incredible projects, but at the same time, you are rethinking and remaking entire ecologies of design. And we've just talked about even rethinking the ecology of pedagogy. So be it through these integrative approaches that rethink design right from material through to manufacture, or expanded forms of practice that engage other people, communities, non-humans, all as kind of agents in design. So how do you, when working this way, how do you now think about how we measure success? And perhaps a better term than measuring success is, how do you, what might be the markers of progress for you in and I think I'd love to hear from all three speakers kind of in your own work, because I suspect those might be different. How do you consider these markers of progress when you know you're making a difference, especially in relation to some of the societal questions that have been brought up?
Who's going to go first? I'll go first. Okay, so I think one of the realizations that we had early on in our work, when we started working outside of the academy, is within communities themselves, is that there was this view that we were there to fix problems and then leave. And actually, that doesn't set up infrastructure, whether it be a material or social or technological, that can be very resilient to change. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I guess one of the markers of progress, is setting up projects that have forms of resilience built into them and really think through what is the social sustainability in that project. So, a very easy example is thinking about how we reorganize the funding of projects. So we don't use volunteers in any of our work. Everyone's paid a day rate the same as us. And that enables a kind of leveling up of how people are able to be involved. We also provide technology, and we set up lending systems. We can provide childcare if we need to. And the funding for that is something that stays long after the initial built output or whatever it might be kind of exists. So we're trying to build up what does that social infrastructure look like? So for example, in Block West, it became a catalyst for a local crew of people that now are working on a series of projects, not just with us, but with our collaborators and partners, so that they can create and design new careers for themselves that enable them to continuously stay engaged in this kind of work because it's important to them, or they've discovered how important it is for them. And so I think that's at its very core is kind of a marker of project progress, is really about that kind of care ethics around the social sustainability in the work and being able to make sure that people can continue to participate.
Great. Donna or Achim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about the question. Sorry, because I'm not even sure whether it's early, the right time to evaluate progress or identify markers of progress. Maybe that's part of a system that we all want to actually escape from. But I think what I find important is, let's say, that navigation of the boundary between what we traditionally call academia and what we call practice, which I'm also not entirely sure whether these are actually proper delineations of, let's say, activities. But I think once you are able, or let's say for us, if we are able to cross this boundary several times back and forth, that's usually an indication that we are dealing with a concern that goes beyond our direct, let's say, sphere of influence and is of relevance for other stakeholders and communities. And I think that is an important aspect, no? Because I think let's say we are also very often caught in silos that suggest a kind of pseudo relevance that may not exist beyond the boundary of that, let's say, community in which we act. And I think that sometimes also means to engage very, very deeply with, let's say, communities that may not necessarily share all the values and approaches that we like to promote, because I think only in that way you can really address the concerns on a larger level. But generally, I find it not so easy to actually answer the question, to be honest, and I'm wondering whether, and let's say, such an assessment would not be premature.
So working
an easier way to put it is, how do you know, or how do you think that you've made a difference?
Yeah, I understand that, but I think we have to agree that the starting point is that any difference is actually, let's say, a good step and probably a step forward. So that's the situation we are kind of facing. No? We know that the way we do things now is not future-proof and not sustainable in any way. And I think there is an increasing level of awareness that this is the case. But I wouldn't
know necessarily what are markers to say that we're not just moving, but that we're moving somehow in a direction that is promising. But I think at the moment we're still at the stage where actually I think almost any movement is worthwhile exploring and let's say trying out.
Dana?
So I think that coming from sort of an evidence-based framework, I have a love-and-hate relationship to metrics, maybe similarly to Achim's assessment. However, I think that there is there's an aspect of discovery within the parameters of a design that offers through interaction with research that produces certain level of joy, which I find always encouraging and moves us towards a new ways of thinking and where we want to position our design research. And usually it's not just personal joys, it's a kind of a collective joy of finding things that we thought worked, but we discovered it didn't. And so to me, there are a couple of examples perhaps I have to be more specific. For example, the idea of kind of a progress as it measured through architectural profession by establishing some forms of metrics of evaluation that currently exist, such as LEED system, for example, right? The house that we have built 10 years ago, which used a thermal mass, the kind of actuation of a heat transferred through thermal mass, so a chunk of concrete that essentially completely eliminated need for mechanical air conditioning, allows us to qualify for LEED silver, but not beyond that, because we did not use advanced mechanical cooling system. So the irony of how you look at design as something that is holistic beyond the current standardization ways, even though within a profession that metric method is meant within the kind of a framework of industry ethics that tries to do good, but understanding that actually thinking through design rather than thinking through the kind of a standardization or methods of evaluation that supposed to produce betterment of a society. Discovering the gap, however absurd, kind of gave us joy and started a new kind of outline of research that really led to this idea of trying to look at relationship beyond just sort of a disciplinary understanding of impact. And I think to me, we really look at try to resource history, not necessarily just cultural history, but material history from pre-industrial era relative to understanding of material impact, kind of vernacular processes that produce environments that are possibly more ecologically functional, and but through the impact of technology, kind of a distributed technology model could be brought up to sort of a new way of thinking about a relationship between energy technology and spatial use, culture use, kind of the sort of a hyper-local model is slightly different way of kind of discovering how you evaluate that, or how that kind of brings us joy of not necessarily doing the right thing, but doing the thing that is missing, is sort of kind of a building of that on that curiosity, is which drives our work further. So, and as it drives the work further, there seems to be more interest, more kind of joy of making that kind of work, which to me and to the group of people I work so closely with is, I guess, the most, the biggest justification of moving towards something.
I'm going to start asking some of the questions that we've had rolling in from the audience on the chat here. There may be ways that some of these open up in things that were just discussed, but I'd like to first share a question from Lauren Amin, who I think was first initially asking this for Achim, but I think opens up to all of you. in a manner of really thinking how you plan for the unpredictable. And Donna, this might just go a little bit as well with the joy you were talking about, but it insightfully looks a little bit at thinking through in computational and physical experiments, predicting behavior and offering us a chance to rethink material usage. So where in your process or where in the whole effort are you allowing to either plan for or embrace the unpredictable when we look at our material research? And Achim, this was initially addressed to you, so you might be on the hot seat first.
Okay, I will make an attempt to give an answer to that. I think it comes down to the definition of unpredictability. I think, I mean, if you just look at the history of working with timber, which of course is one of the materials that I would say has one of the longest traditions as a construction material. I think what was considered to be unpredictability in the end is only natural variability of a material that is grown as the functional tissue of a tree, rather than being physically produced. So the unpredictable is in the end sort of an understanding of the anatomical differences that you may get as a result of a kind of ecological response of a tree to its surroundings. I think I think in that sense, what we're trying to do is to, let's say, understand that the unpredictable is not a problem, because it is something that does not fit our, let's say, understanding of standardization that is sort of at the base of industrial processes since the Industrial Revolution, but that actually the innate variability of the complex materials that we're interested in dealing with is actually one of their most interesting characteristics. So I think, for example, the swelling and shrinking of wood was always considered to be a somewhat unpredictable behavior. And I think we have around 4,000 years of crafts history to prevent this from happening. Actually, if we look at wood processing as it happens now, 71% of the energy goes into preventing wood from swelling and shrinking in service conditions. And I think the driver for all the work we're doing on looking at how we can actually employ hygroscopicity, sort of the ability of wood to adsorb and desorb water, how we can actually take advantage of that, because I think it's one of the smartest aspects of this natural material that has been attempted to be re-engineered many, many times with synthetic materials. And here you have it, and it's just sort of in the basic constituents of the cellulosic microfibrils. And in the end, it's about understanding how you engage with the material and on what level you would like to engage as a designer, and how many preconceptions you're ready to accept from your textbooks to consider something unpredictable or problematic, let's say. So I think what is nice about computation is that it allows you to question exactly those preconceptions. And I think that in the end, those projects about the hygroscopicity are vehicles that maybe open up a certain, let's say, a different perspective on how we can deal with those kind of material behaviors that we usually consider to be too complex and have just taken out of the, let's say, realm of what we design with. Best example, in the United States, we don't call a piece of wood anymore. We call it a 2x2, 2x4. So a total disregard of the, let's say, complex anatomy that we actually want to design with and can design with. And in that sense, I'm also struggling a bit with the notion of mass timber, because it's, I think, trying to homogenize a material to make it, let's say, easy and predictable to work with, and somehow disregard some of the fantastically interesting aspects in a, I would say, a 20th century approach to the material usage.
I think it's a really important point because I mean, historically, we're looking at standardization and democratization as kind of a parallel terms that we inherited from the kind of a recent history. And especially now, where the kind of urgency of issues of equity and kind of social justice coming out, there's some of this notion of kind of a even distribution of resources come from that sort of a history of material production that produced this sort of a standardization and normalization. And I think the difference in terms of kind of a predictability and unpredictability is to sort of learn from the historical processes that tell us a lot of patterns that kind of repeat with a slight shift, historical shift. So, making these assumptions about that the playing field from the kind of a manufacturing industry that delivers off-the-shelf materials is the one that produces these forms of democratization with the kind of social environments. And I think that's where the kind of a distributed model of how do you make access, the kind of issue of access to knowledge and kind of a distributed technologies that might produce much more variety of kind of a localized manufacturing methods that deal with local resources rather than kind of setting up these global networks that produce much more greater emissions and carbon footprint relative to production of these materials is really important. So the kind of how the issue of decarbonization, not just in terms of how we produce new things relative to using less or producing less carbon, but how we actually remove carbon that already exists, completely changes the paradigm of what is the potential material responsibility of architecture. There is a lot of kind of a new research on mineralization processes that are in basalt and limestone production, kind of that capture carbon. So the sort of agricultural industry is looking at like growing rocks in the land that actually take current carbon from the atmosphere. Which, if you think about some of the sort of a historical architecture, kind of a pre-industrial architecture that is really tightly linked to that form of materiality, one can start to rethink some of the processes of architectural production that actually contributes to the decarbonization rather than just eliminates the amount of carbon that the new production emits.
Mollie, maybe in thinking through some of the production topics that have been coming up, there's a question specifically for you that I think relates in a way, coming from Elliot Smithberger, that mentions you spoke about the relative lack of digitization within the construction industry, and will increasing the degree of digitization and automation eventually phase out skilled human labor, or is there a way to create efficient, equitable method of labor through more automation?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I mean, I think we have to look contextually at the answer to that. So for example, in the UK government is putting a lot of investment into automation in construction, wanting to be a leader in advancing automation in construction. And one of the things that you can see when you look at some of the data that they're using is that there's a risk of 600,000 jobs over the next 15 years. But when you look at the scarcity of those jobs already, there's a huge scarcity in terms of skilled human labor. So we're actually looking at a very precarious and dangerous situation where if we don't actually put that existing skilled labor, which is incredibly scarce, at the center of how we begin to think about designing new construction technologies, we're going to be very much creating a more inequitable situation than it already exists. So one of the ways that we're thinking about that question is how do we co-design or co-create construction technologies, not just with technologists, but also with the people who will be using those technologies. How can we begin to imagine new kinds of jobs that can enhance that existing amount of skilled labor and build on it? How do we make that appealing to younger generations? It's very unappealing. We were working where we were in conversation with an organization in London, which was trying to understand what kind of job opportunities are for kids that come from East London estates. And a lot of these kids were wanting to become footballers their whole lives. And then they wanted to become app developers. And there's a flux of app development opportunities, but there isn't a flux of footballing opportunities. And being able to demonstrate that there are other ways of thinking through that job pathway for them, being able to ensure that they can engage with their communities, that they can engage with what is around them and how it's produced is a really big challenge. And I think that there's a lot of mistrust already in the younger generation when it comes to built environment. There's a lot of apathy and lack of awareness of what kinds of opportunities are out there. So part of it is about how do we educate and how do we build up these frameworks for more equity, and also just to recognize that the situation is pretty disastrous as it is.
This maybe expands to a question that Emerald Sky asked that I think could be addressed for all of you. To what extent do you think the role of intelligent systems will change the architecture, engineering, and construction industry?
Maybe to pick up on Mollie's Mollie's work, I think that this notion of intelligent has been always, especially in the last 20, 25 years in architecture, has been used as sort of a form of distancing or kind of a form of expertise that moves us away from making things in a real life, right? There's kind of a dematerialization, distancing from direct impact. I mean, we see it through the time of pandemic, you know, everything's in 2D suddenly. But I think that and I see it with my kids too, there's this kind of a new agility through understanding computing that engages new forms of accessibility, but it has to be really thought through in terms of understanding its own audience and who that audience is, because I think there are huge gaps, huge societal gaps relative to having access to certain forms of communication. And at the same time, there's much more differentiation of the kind of forms of expertise that even architecture schools started producing relative to these kind of a more localized form of manufacturing that actually started quite a few startups and businesses that relate to kind of a production, more localized production rather than large scale industry productions. So this sort of so on one hand, it offers distributed models. On the other hand, I think we have to be very aware of building the pathways, kind of educational pathways from institution like three of us are at to all the way down to K-12 and kind of within kind of a local places we're embedded within. So this issue of exchange or participation is not just us as experts delivering the product or project as into the community, but really the kind of a representation of the community within a place of the institution, which completely changes the dynamic. And I think the kind of a building awareness that you know, certain technologies are not inaccessible. Things like, you know, we did this workshop with the kids where trying to talk about binder jet printing, where we essentially tried to build the sandcastles. The notion of kind of like, how do you shape things? How do you author projects through understanding that technology can help the kind of translate one's intention of the hand into the material directly suddenly became much more much easier to understand. So a lot of it is about thinking through the educational processes down to elementary education, and also having different forms of representations, the way the institutions are set up, where it's not us going out, but the community coming in. And I think that dramatically changes the dynamics. And I think that change could really also precipitate or address these issues of sort of distancing and moving away from something that you can actually understand with your hands as a kind of a form of tactility. So, which is very much of a shift from technology being the evil of the society versus the technology is kind of a part of human culture that we invented, and it becomes really much more embedded and close to us as a form of kind of an equitable way of thinking about the material world.
Unfortunately, we're actually running out of time for this live event. So apologies for not getting to all the questions or trying to link some of the questions together to our guests today. So to conclude this Taubman College public event, we want to again thank Donna Cupkova, Achim Menges, and Mollie Claypool for presenting their work and joining us in conversations today. We also want to thank Ishan Singh for his help with producing this virtual Commons event. Please look out for additional conversations from our speakers in the link article for Gradient, which is Taubman College's online journal that the ACDCC group is leading this year. And the first drop is scheduled for November, so please look out for that. The next Taubman College public event will be the Mixed Presence Symposium, Post-Commodities, Architecture After Stuff, taking place on October 8th and 9th. So look forward to seeing you then. And meanwhile, take care and thank you for joining us today.